Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Ability Summit 2024 session on the role of policy in advancing accessibility. My name is Jamie Dean. I am a senior corporate counsel here at Microsoft working on accessibility regulation. I'm also blind, meaning that not only do I support our teams in creating products and services that are accessible, but I rely on the accessibility of those products and services in doing my job every day. I am joined by three incredible guests here to speak about disability and accessibility policy. First, we have Stephanie Cadieux. Stephanie is the first Chief Accessibility Officer for Canada. As part of that role, she's responsible for monitoring and reporting on the implementation of the Accessible Canada Act, which is no small feat. Before becoming the Chief Accessibility Officer, Stephanie spent more than a decade in the Legislative Assembly for British Columbia, and she held a number of government appointments. She has a long personal and professional history of disability advocacy, and that is informed by her experience as a person who uses a wheelchair. Stephanie, thank you and welcome.
Thank you very much.
Next, Senator Jordan Steele-John is a member of the Australia Greens. He is a senator for Western Australia. At the time he was elected, he was the youngest person to be elected to Australia's Senate, and he is the first and only person with a disability and wheelchair user to be an Australian senator. Jordan is a passionate advocate not only for disability rights, but also for disability pride. Jordan, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to Ability Summit.
Absolute pleasure to be here.
Last but not least, we have Dr. Reed Jewett-Smith. Reed is the Director of Research and Policy for Disability in a not-for-profit that empowers more than 500 corporate partners, including Microsoft, to advance disability inclusion and equality in their own organizations. Reed's background spans nonprofit management, social science research, and strategic consulting. At Disability In, her research touches on areas including disability and sustainability reporting, and adoption of corporate inclusion practices. Like myself and our other panelists, Reed is also a part of the disability community. Reed, thank you so much for joining us and welcome.
Thank you. Awesome to be here, everybody.
All right, well, let's dive right in because we have some interesting things to talk about. Nobody on this panel will be surprised by the proposition that people with disabilities face barriers in many areas of life, whether that be employment, education, transportation, or healthcare. But it seems to me that there is one meta issue that contributes to and connects each of these barriers, and that issue is the persistent negative perceptions of disability. There's research from multiple universities that shows that disability bias is one of the strongest biases that people hold. It's a bias that grows stronger as we age. And on the societal level, disability bias changes very slowly. How's that for a lead-in? Jordan, I'm gonna start with you and say and ask you this question. Is this research consistent with what you see in your policy work? And really in 2024, is disability bias still this big of a challenge to creating equality for people with disabilities?
Well, in short, yes. I mean, what is really important, I think, to ground this conversation in is an acknowledgement of the reality that across the globe, about 1.3 billion human beings are disabled. If we look at the latest statistics on the number of neurodivergent people across the globe, we estimate that about 15 to 20% of the global population is neurodivergent in some way. So we are a massive community of disabled people together, and we experience together serious systemic bias, as you were saying, Jamie. It's not just bias; it is ableism, and I think it is really important. We call it by its name. We name it up. It is a discriminatory belief and thought system that says that disabled people are inherently lesser, broken, to be pitied, to be excluded, to be separated. And it exists everywhere, in every culture, on every continent. It looks different in different cultural contexts. It bubbles up in different ways, but it is always there. And it is so important that as we build policy solutions to it, we recognize that reality. And in spaces like the United States, in Australia, in the United Kingdom, some of the ways that ableism shows itself has remarkable commonalities. Think about the differences between the political systems, the policy systems of countries like Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, and yet in each of those jurisdictions you have systemic, legalized wage discrimination against disabled people, which we'll get to a little bit later. But the reason, the ableist reason at the center of that wage discrimination is the belief that disabled people are inherently lesser and therefore it is acceptable to pay them less legally. We aren't talking about illegal wage theft. We're talking about legal differential discrimination in terms of wage. So we've got to recognize that, and also recognize the reality that because it permeates everything, because we're all soaked in ableism, if you like, we as disabled people are also soaked in it. And so we often internalize it, believing that we actually are lesser, that we are broken, that we do not deserve to ask for equal rights and equal treatment in workplaces or in community or in social spaces. And so the first person to be liberated from ableism is in fact the disabled person themselves. And as we liberate ourselves from ableism, there needs to be an acknowledgement that often disabled people perpetrate ableism against each other because of the idea that ableism gives us, that there is a perfect form of human, often constructed as a non-disabled, often European or white kind of mythic man often, and that everything that digresses away from that, diverges away from that, becomes more broken, lesser, and able to be treated worse. And so often somebody like myself who uses a manual wheelchair, I've got cerebral palsy, there's a temptation to go, oh, well, I do have a disability, but, I'm not blind, or, I do have a disability, but, I'm not autistic, and that is an expression also of internalized lateral ableism that we've got to push out of ourselves as we build a movement to address the reality of ableism in our society.
So it's safe to say that it is a problem. Disability bias and ableism systematized across the world.
In a word, yes. That you can see that I'm a politician because I managed to turn the simple answer yes into a short stump speech. So,
I love it. But that leaves us with a harder question in some ways for Stephanie, which is, what can policy do about it? It's a huge problem. It's a systematized problem. What can policy do to change this ingrained negative perception of disability?
Yeah, well, firstly, let's just say ditto to everything that Senator Pete has said, because it's true, unfortunately, still today, it is true. But I do think policy can help. It can help by requiring people to think about and address accessibility. And unless you have a culture shift, and unless a culture shift happens in tandem with new policy, then new policy won't be effective. So, for example, it's probably better to use an example. Many people refuse to wear seatbelts at first, in spite of it being the law, because they didn't understand the safety benefit. They really didn't understand why this was being imposed upon them. So unless the reasons behind policy are well understood, then compliance is going to be a major challenge no matter what. And while policy can set the stage, I would say, by mandating things like training or changes to the design and delivery of services to make them accessible, that real change comes from transforming the attitudes and the value system beneath that, so that disability is no longer seen as less than, but rather as a normal part of human diversity, and one that comes with valuable insights, experience and perspective. And when I say culture shift, a culture shift means going beyond compliance, right, to embracing inclusion as a core value. It involves promoting positive representations of people with disabilities in the media, which can help to challenge the long-standing stereotypes. It's about education, where education plays such a crucial role in the shift by integrating disability awareness, integrating students into schools, making that normal, into awareness and disability awareness into curriculums, fostering understanding from a really young age. I've seen some of that change myself in my 33 years in the disability community, with how my experience was different from that of my nieces and nephews. Now, I think it's critical too that organizations that are looking to do the work, governments that are looking to do the work, have to engage with people with disabilities in all aspects of that work. And it's something else that policy can ensure. Policy can say, you must. And in fact, the Accessible Canada Act does just that. And then when people with disabilities are included in planning and policy making, when they're represented in the media or in visible leadership positions in politics or the corporate world, it helps change culture. The insights and experiences that they have folded into final products can shatter the biases and highlight all of the valuable contributions and innovation that people with disabilities can bring sort of to society as a whole. And while legislation like the Accessible Canada Act, which is policy, lays the groundwork for those changes, the foundation of the effort really is the belief in inclusion and equality. And we have to foster that environment where differences are celebrated and accommodated and viewed as normal and necessary to create an inclusive society. It's about changing hearts and minds and making inclusivity a reflex, not a requirement. Right now, we have that we still, I would argue, in all of our countries, have this sense that, well, accessibility is a nice to have. Accessibility and inclusion are things you do when there's money left over. It's charitable. When we get to it, we'll do that. And it's really about helping people understand that no, it's none of those things. It's actually a requirement. It's just the way it has to be done. It's not optional.
I love what you're saying, sort of the all-embracing approach and the shift in mindset. Reed, you're obviously working on policy in a little bit of a different context from Jordan and Stephanie, being in the nonprofit sector, but working with corporations. How do you see the role of corporations in shaping disability policy and more importantly, in changing perceptions of people with disabilities?
Yeah, it's a great question that I think I'm going to do what Jordan did. And I'm going to give a short answer and then I'm going to elaborate for a while, because the short answer is exactly what Stephanie just said. It's that sort of spectrum from compliance to culture, right? And moving the conversation past compliance with externally imposed policies and making it like an intrinsic element of culture. And so I come at this from the corporate or the employment lens, right? And I want to acknowledge what Jordan said, that we all know that discrimination is alive and well. And in order to complement both like the grassroots social movement perspective from the disability community and the political organizing for legislation that's going to guarantee civil rights, what we do is we work towards the need for policy that addresses inequitable and unequal employment outcomes for people with disabilities. Because what we need is buy-in from this other incredibly influential pillar of society, which is business. Mm-hmm. So corporations have tremendous influence, not over just our consumer choices and the range of products, and of course, whether those products are accessible or not, but also how disability is taken up in the workforce. And like you said, Stephanie, in marketing and media, in representation. And then where I'm increasingly focused is in regulations, right? So how corporate behaviors dictate the types of regulations that rulemaking bodies even entertain for policy. So what we really need to do is to work on that influence as a lever to advocate for more inclusive economies. So like one fresh example that's top of mind for me is how corporations can have a really profound role in shaping disability policy through public rulemaking bodies. Mm-hmm. So when companies begin to collect and disclose information about the number of people with disabilities in their workforces, they're then bringing transparency to a historic problem area. And then obviously the underrepresentation and the underemployment of people with disabilities in the private sector and corporate spaces, multinationals around the world. So when they begin to then collect and publish that information, that can in turn influence regulatory bodies like the Securities and Exchange Commission here in the US, Canada's Securities Commissions, the new financial regulatory bodies in Europe, to then make rules about transparency around human capital that can include disability to benefit both investors, but also employees and consumers. So I think that is sort of the policy piece, but there's also a perception element, right? So in terms of changing perceptions, which is overturning the historic, at least in the U.S., association between disability and not being able to work, right? Mm-hmm. Almost like as another layer on top of what Jordan was talking about, which is sort of the, existential or epistemic like value of a person. I'm just talking about this very superficial association we have between disability and not being capable of work. Yeah. So we can also get at that from the corporate perspective by looking at their public commitments, and those can speak volumes about what's valuable, like is integrating disability into your annual reporting or normalizing the depiction of people with disabilities in your like everyday marketing and imagery. And then, of course, the choice to ensure that all your service platforms are accessible before anyone has to ask you to make them accessible, right? So I think there is a really prominent role for the private sector to play in influencing attitudes, in kind of evangelizing inclusion at the highest levels, and then making sure that workplace practices and policies are supporting, ending, sort of eliminating economic exclusion.
Totally agree.
So I want to go from what you're talking about, Reed, and the important role that the private sector has to play, and also go back though to something that Jordan referenced, which is the way that the private sector can also be contributing to systemic inequality. So Microsoft has been very active in supporting bipartisan legislation here in the United States to repeal what's called Section 14C of the Fair Labor Standards Act. And what 14C does is it allows certain employers to pay employees with disabilities less than the federal minimum wage, sometimes as little as pennies on the dollar. And what's so interesting to me is this issue is important to us here in the U.S., but Jordan, this is an issue in Australia as well, right? There was a royal commission recently that took about 5 years to investigate inequality in people with disabilities. They came up with something like 222 recommendations for how Australia could be a more just place for people with disabilities. But one of those that was really prominent, one of the prominent recommendations was phasing out the practice of employers paying less than minimum wage to employees with disabilities. Could you tell us, Jordan, a little bit about the Royal Commission's work and that specific recommendation, and maybe how is it being leveraged to make real change in Australia?
Absolutely. So the Royal Commission, and for anyone not familiar with that term, that is the kind of highest form of investigation which an Australian government is capable of ordering. It has powers to demand evidence, witnesses, and basically reach in and uncover systemic failure and systemic discrimination. And the need for a Royal Commission has been known by disabled people in Australia for decades. It's not that there was any absence of information about discrimination or absence of lived experience testimony speaking to the extent of discrimination. There's been more inquiries than I could name in a day into these issues. What was not available, or what we had come to realize as a community, however, was that systems, governments, corporations, you name it, were systemically hiding the extent of the problem and their role in its creation and continuation. So we began campaigning for a Royal Commission. That was not a widely supported idea by any of our parties at the beginning of about a kind of 20-year campaign, but through some incredible advocacy, we were able to basically embarrass leaders into holding an investigation, and then it got underway. And it discovered, as we expected it would, terrible examples of violence, abuse, exploitation and neglect, and policy and political failure that was trapping disabled people in Australia into what I call the cycle of segregation. So a disabled person is born, diagnosed, and from the moment they come into the world, given all of those negative ableist perceptions around their value as a human being, they are then taken into a segregated education system, so separate from non-disabled students. They then move from segregated education to segregated work, where they are paid on average a couple of bucks an hour, and they are then placed in segregated housing together with other disabled people that they don't know and haven't chosen to live with. And all of the parts of that cycle of segregation lead us to be abused, be neglected, exploited, and ultimately die earlier. The average life expectancy of an intellectually disabled Australian is some 10 to 15 years less in some areas than the rest of the population. And in many places, far higher than that, which is an absolutely outrageous statistic. When it comes to wage exploitation, this is, as in the United States and other places, we have specific law that supports and enables this discrimination, and it is passionately defended by many senior figures in political spaces on both sides of the political divide. And so what has been needed is, as Reid was mentioning there, a grassroots movement of disabled people coming together and demanding an end to this discrimination, bound together by a shared sense of our value, of our humanity, and a pride in our identity as disabled people, and an active embrace of the idea that we are here, we are disabled, and we are proud, and we demand our human rights are upheld. Because, as Stephanie was saying, our human rights are not optional, because our humanity is not optional. And that's what we are seeing across Australia now, a real growth in this disability pride and justice movement, with organic grassroots organisations, festivals, marches, dialogues springing up as disabled people organise for the implementation of the recommendations and the wider societal change. It's quite exciting. I'm quite excited by it.
Absolutely. Well, with great reason. Mm-hmm. Reid, let me give you a chance to speak on the corporate behalf for a second about the sub-minimum wage issue specifically. Is that an issue that Disability In is engaged in, and how are its members reacting to that issue?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So let me take a step back and say that one of our sort of key instruments that we use to assess disability inclusion in the private sector and among major employers, including Microsoft, is an instrument. It's an annual survey called the Disability Equality Index. And it's an international benchmark for disability inclusive practices and policies that large employers can take here in the US, but also Germany, Brazil, India, Japan, Philippines, Canada, and the UK. Here in the U.S., where the Disability Equality Index has been around for 10 years, we saw we're very happy to see in the 2023 Disability Equality Index results that not one of the 485 participating companies held a 14C certificate, nor did anyone in their supply chains. Now, that hasn't always been the case, right? So over time, what we've seen, the index has actually helped raise awareness and shed light on something that a lot of companies don't even know about, right? They don't think they do it. And then they do some digging, get a layer down maybe within their own operations, within subsidiaries, and then within their supply chain. And they discover, that someone somewhere in their network, in fact, does hold a 14C certificate. So over time, the index has actually helped companies discover and eliminate sheltered workshops from within their value chains. And we are just very happy that we're able to sort of lend that support to companies to, eliminate it from some of the major employers. I also want to say, sort of as a footnote, I think one thing that we can think about moving forward from this conversation and paying close attention to are the implications for these kinds of labor practices coming out of the new regulatory wave in Europe, which we'll touch on in a little bit. Under the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, there are going to be new teeth in looking for abuses in labor practices within the supply chain that are going to affect multinationals around the world operating and doing business in Europe. So I think that'll be something that we can keep an eye on as kind of a moving target over the next few years for global labor practices. Jordan, why are you smiling so hard?
I'm smiling because, in some ways it's wonderful, but I'm smiling because what you're describing is basically supporting companies to kind of go on a bit of an investigation and discover if it's in their supply chain, right? Whereas in Australia, we've got a bit, it just shows you how far we need to go. Companies are proud of it, and governments are proud of it. They will proudly say, we source, our largest domestic airline, proudly sources. When you get on the plane and you unpack the little earphones to plug in, proudly provided by an Australian disability enterprise, which is what they're called. So there's this idea, and it is so insidious, that if not for these structures, these quote unquote poor people, is often how it's categorized, that they would have no job, no social connection. And so therefore we're actually doing disabled people a favor by systemically discriminating against us in the workplace. And so I think it's one of those spaces where I'm actually so proud to see in the United States and elsewhere so much progress towards this issue, and we've got to catch up in Australia and really push back against this idea that this is how we make things better for disabled people by paying us less and making sure that we never are able to retire with any forms of savings.
Now, I think
this is a sardonic smile. It wasn't a smile of happiness. I was like, wow, what would it look like for Qantas to be like, oh my God, what do you mean it's in our supply chain, rather than proudly it's in our booklet,
I have started this off strong in our panel with jumping right to the jugular vein of talking about systemic ableism. And I feel like Jordan and I have vibed on that a little bit, but there's also a reason to feel optimistic. After all, the four of us are convened here talking about disability policy at a forum that's going to attract, tens of thousands of people who are interested in learning about this issue. So certainly it seems like disability is gaining attention as a policy issue of consequence, both in the government and in the private sector. And there are some really exciting things that are happening around the world. Stephanie, you are closely involved with one of those very exciting things. The Accessible Canada Act was passed in 2019. Its goal is to make Canada barrier-free by 2040. That's an awesome and incredible goal. Can you just give us some insights about the Act, its goals, and how are things going?
Well, yes, I can. And I agree. There is a lot actually to be excited about right now at this time. We're seeing these conversations about accessibility and inclusion, about people with disabilities, launched in all sorts of places that they never were before. And the work is happening everywhere. All countries are moving in the right direction, it seems, and it's exciting. But the Accessible Canada Act really does, for us in Canada, represent a landmark effort to eliminate barriers across key areas of life for Canadians with disabilities. The goal is a very ambitious barrier-free Canada by 2040. And the plan is to get there by focusing on sort of 7 areas: employment, built environment, information and communication technology, transportation, procurement, services, I'm missing one. Communication, other than communication technology. But crucially, it puts the onus on systems and organizations to remove barriers rather than leaving it up to individuals. So we've had human rights law for decades that says you can't discriminate against a person with a disability, and yet we do. In government policy, we do in government programs, we do in the private sector all of the time. So this is really about completely shifting the script and taking the onus off the individuals to fight for their rights and enforcing them in the other direction. So my role is as an independent advisor to the minister. My role is enshrined in the Act to monitor and report on the progress that's being made, the challenges, the systemic or emerging issues that might impede progress, or things that are happening internationally, other places that might influence what Canada does. And in doing so, I'm playing a convening role, a collaborative role, working closely with partners, experts, stakeholders, bringing best practices and knowledge together and challenging folks to go forward further, faster. And my efforts are geared, I would say, towards raising awareness about the importance of accessibility and inclusion, not just as a matter of compliance, but as a cornerstone of a diverse and vibrant society. The Act provides the framework for a more inclusive Canada, but my role is really to champion the vision and drive that meaningful change. And that's going to have to go well beyond the reach of the legislation itself into other levels of government, into the private sector, and into all of our everyday lives and that change in our thinking about the value of people with disabilities.
Yeah, what a beautiful lead into something I wanted to come back to Jordan about too, which is this concept of disability pride, not specifically a government policy, but just an issue of the way that we see ourselves. You mentioned, Jordan, doing work on that issue. This is another thing for us to feel optimistic about. You tell us a little bit about what you've been doing in Australia to increase disability pride, and maybe start with, what is disability pride?
What is disability pride? Yes, so disability pride, well, when people hear that phrase, and sometimes often disabled people, right? They hear the phrase and they think, I actually thought this when I first heard it. A bit of your brain goes, yeah, but I'm not, it's not awesome all the time to be disabled. Sometimes it's actually really frustrating and annoying, and I wish it wasn't disabled. And it took me a while to realize that disability pride is created precisely for that moment. For the moment when you are, for the 9th time in the last couple of months, like the Uber driver just decides to keep on driving because they've seen that you've got a chair. Or you get to the beach that you went to as a kid and they still haven't put the matting in so you can actually roll onto it. Or somebody speaks to your the person that you are with in that particular moment as though they are your carer, completely ignores you. And the multiple examples, that's just what I can think of in the moment. But like for people with disabilities, with different impairment types, those examples, those instances, they hit you. And they hit you, they cut, right? And in that moment, there's a opportunity to either say, damn, that feels bad, and it's bad because I'm broken, or damn, that feels bad, and what is the source of that feeling is the attitude in society, the person that didn't put the ramp in, the person that made the person I've just interact with think it's okay not to speak directly to me, or the Uber driver just to drive on. That's the source of that, and actually I am whole and part of a community whose resistance and persistence I can be damn proud of. And that's what disability pride offers, that alternative answer in that moment of pain, distress, frustration. And from that, it allows you to connect to others. All 4 million of us here in 20% of us here in the population in Australia, which is roughly about 4 million people, the billions of us globally. It gives us the opportunity to put our arms around each other and embrace the reality, yes, of our individual experiences as literally individual people with different impairments, whose experience of disability is shaped by the interaction of that impairment with the unique circumstances we find ourselves in or wish to find ourselves in, and yet we are bound also together by a shared experience of the way in which we are treated, and a shared experience of our innovative, creative, incredible capacity, not only to overcome, but to shoot for the goddamn stars and get there in incredible ways that make amazing contributions. So, and through that pride, through the positivity, the hope that is born from that, you really have the engine of the disability rights and justice movement. And you see that in other civil rights movements, whether it be the movements for women's equality globally, whether it be the Black Pride movement, the Queer Pride movement. The tipping point for those movements was community coming together, not only to push back, but also to celebrate identity. And say, we're here, we're not going away, and we're damn proud of what we are together. And that's what disability pride means to me, and why I think it's got so much to contribute to these kind of conversations and these movements.
Yes. Yeah, I think it's that moment too. I think the disability pride movement and really, you can see it in the conversations around how we describe ourselves. Do we describe ourselves as people with disabilities or disabled or something else altogether? It's a changing landscape for lots of reasons. But I think the big thing is coming together and saying, it's a way of saying, hey, wait a second, I'm good. You guys got the problem, right? Like, I'm good, so figure it out. It's okay that you don't understand and you need to learn. That's okay. But it's not okay to say we're not going to do it. It's not okay to say we're going to continue to allow the discrimination. It's not okay to say we're going to wait and do it later.
Yeah, totally. I mean, we are having a conversation via an online facility platform in a way that enables us to connect across the world. If people remember back to COVID times and how quickly work moved online, and there was this unique feeling in the disability community at that period of time where, obviously abject terror because of the risk of COVID to disabled people, but also there's this weird kind of, I'm sure there's a great German word for it, where people were suddenly, wide clumps of society were saying, oh no, it's so terrible because we feel so isolated. We can't leave our home to go. And there was a lot of like, oh really? Wow, can't imagine what that's like, not to be able to access places when you want to, and da-da-da. And through that, suddenly all these workplace adaptations that we've been arguing for so long, working from home, suddenly poof,
ta-da! It can be done.
Done. So it just shows you that it's too hard, we're not sure how to do it. Actually, with the right encouragement and the right pressure, people do find a way. It is possible.
Yeah, well, you're exactly right. Through the pandemic, at the very beginning, all of a sudden, overnight, within weeks, what used to be we can't possibly work remotely. No, it's not possible to collaborate this way. And yet within weeks, legislatures around the world were functioning that way. And businesses were functioning that way. Stores had figured out, geez, we could actually deliver stuff.
We could deliver things.
Or we could have curbside service. Really, wow. And the fact that some of that is reversing back is problematic. We need to actually push for some of it to be permanent,
very much
because
so.
these are things that people with disabilities have needed, have innovated, had suggested for years, but it hadn't been normalized, in quotes. And this is, in so many ways, technology broadly has this opportunity to emancipate people with disabilities in a lot of ways. There are lots of concerns, but there are lots of things about it that there's just tremendous opportunity right now, and it's just ripe for the taking.
Yeah, I see that in the U.S. The return to work conversation is very sort of quickly turning into a spark plug around disability and economic access. And one of the things that's really fascinating that we have not seen in decades is that halfway through 2024, people with disabilities are expected to make up 5% of the active U.S. workforce, which is the first time in a long time that that's been the case. And so we're sort of working towards that point as a benchmark, and it's all tied into these bigger conversations. And that's something that we're incredibly active in the U.S. and with our sort of multinational base, advocating for this kind of continuation of flexible, remote, hybrid. Yeah.
Reed, could you give us just maybe a minute on the related issue that you mentioned earlier of transparency and the employment and inclusion of people with disabilities in corporations? You referenced some regulations in Europe. What's going on and sort of how will that affect people with disabilities around the world?
Yeah. So we are, well, let me say this. I just want to echo also what Stephanie and Jordan said, that it's really about this shift to placing the onus on systems, not on individuals, right? That there's sort of a tipping point that's externalizing and creating accountability around inclusion for the first time. And so the thing that is sort of top of mind for me right now is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which is coming out of the European Union. And so the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive is a new sort of framework for mandatory ESG disclosures that includes people with disabilities. And so this directive has led to the creation of a new set of sustainability standards that explicitly include disability in a couple of really important ways. So we're sort of about to catch this wave, this big wave of transparency around disability in the workforce that's going to extend to both regional and multinational public and private companies that operate in the EU. And so what does this mean? It means that companies now have to basically run disability through their materiality matrices, looking for this new sort of concentric constructs of impact and financial materiality, which in its shortest form is what is your business's impact on people with disabilities, and what is people with disabilities' impact on your business, right? And are there sort of financial and impact elements, right? And with 1.6 billion people in the world, 87 million people in Europe with disabilities, I don't really know how anyone can say no to that. But you run it through your materiality matrix, which is great because that's going to flag every company has to at least think about it, right? And if you deem that it's a material facet of your business, you now are required to report against standards that look at the percentage of people with disabilities in your own workforce and the percentage of people with disabilities disaggregated by gender. Physical accessibility in your own workforce, social protection for workers against loss of income, processes for engaging with vulnerable groups in the workforce like women, migrants, and people with disabilities, engaging workers with disabilities throughout your value chain, engaging consumers with disabilities about user-end impacts. That's going to have huge implications in the accessibility world, disclosing any targets that are related to the sustainability matter. So, if you're aiming to have like a certain percentage of your online business accessible by 2026 and then fully accessible by 2030 or something like that. So sharing your targets, which means you got to make progress towards them. And there's also an opportunity to report on disability at the board level, which is really exciting. And then critically, there's also a new Accessibility Act. So the European Accessibility Act of 2025 is going to require a lot of everyday products and services to be accessible. So transportation, ticketing, banking services, ATMs, any digital operating software systems, TVs, e-readers, online shopping, all of this needs to come into compliance with new accessibility mandates. And so this obviously speaks to the power of those 87 million European people in the workforce with disabilities, as well as to those multinational companies. We're thinking it's going to be about 3,500 US-based companies that fall under scope in the next couple of years that all need to function sustainably in EU markets. And then we're also looking at a lot of ripple effects, right? I mean, I imagine that we're going to see some pretty big sort of ripple effects in terms of sustainability disclosures around disability and the way that other rulemaking bodies, right? So maybe that's the Securities and Exchange Commission here. Maybe it's your, Ontario Securities Commission. Maybe it's other sustainability boards around the world that are going to say, hey, companies are already doing this over there. Like there's not an additional undue burden or cost. Why don't we implement that here into the way that we're thinking about workforce development?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to have to play my best BBC reporter and cut you off there because we're coming up to the end of our time. But Reed, Stephanie, Jordan, this has been an incredible conversation. We could go on for so long talking about these issues. I feel like we only scratched the surface. But thank you so much for being here at Ability Summit. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing to improve the lives and outcomes for people with disabilities. And to everyone who has tuned in, thank you so much for joining our session. Hope you enjoy the remainder of Ability Summit. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Great to connect. Bye.
Thanks.